The sound of the gunshot echoed across the Sawtooth Valley like the crack of God's own whip, sending every living thing within a mile into sudden, terrified silence. Birds exploded from the pines in dark clouds. Elk, grazing on the distant ridge, lifted their heads, ears swiveling toward the source of the violence. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what manner of madness had taken hold of the man standing in the yard of the log cabin. Dalton Revere stood with his arms still extended toward the darkening Idaho sky, the revolver heavy in his hand, a thin ribbon of gun smoke curling upward into the October air. His chest heaved with something that was not exertion, but a deeper, more desperate kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from caring too much for too long with no one to help shoulder the weight. He was 28 years old. He stood 6 feet 5 inches tall with shoulders broad enough that he had to turn sideways to fit through most door frames. His hands were scarred and calloused from 5 years of building everything around him from raw timber and stubbornness. The kind of hands that could split a log with an axe in 3 clean strokes or gentle a spooked horse with a single touch. His hair was dark, kept short, because vanity was a luxury he could not afford. His eyes were amber, the color of good whiskey, held up to lamplight, and at this particular moment, they held a wildness that would have made a stranger take a step back. But there were no strangers here. There was no one here but him and his 2 younger brothers, and the silence that pressed down on this mountain like a physical weight. Dalton lowered the gun slowly, his hand trembling just enough to betray what the rest of him was trying to hide. He had just done something he had never done before in his entire life. He had prayed, not with words whispered into clasped hands in a church pew, not with his head bowed over a meal he was too tired to taste. He had prayed with violence, with desperation, with the kind of raw honesty that only comes when a man has reached the absolute limit of what he can endure alone. God, he had shouted at the sky, his voice cracking on the word. If you're listening, if you're there at all, I need someone, anyone. I can't do this alone anymore. The door of the cabin slammed open, and Sully Revere came running out, his own hand on the pistol at his hip, his amber eyes wide with alarm. At 22, Sully was the youngest of the 3 brothers, and the only one who still smiled, like smiling was easy. He had their mother's warmth in his face, the kind of openness that made strangers trust him on instinct, and animals follow him like he was made of sugar and sunlight. What the hell, Dalton? Sully's voice was breathless, halfway between concern and confusion. I thought someone was shooting at you. Dalton holstered the revolver without looking at his brother. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Just talking to the scout. Sully stopped in the middle of the yard, his boots crunching on the frozen dirt. He looked at his eldest brother for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from alarm to understanding. You fired a gun at the sky to talk to it. That's right. And did the sky talk back? Dalton turned and walked toward the barn, his stride long and purposeful. The kind of walk that said the conversation was over whether Sully wanted it to be or not. But Sully had never been good at taking hints. Dalton, wait. Sully jogged to catch up, falling into step beside him. I know what this is about. You don't know a damn thing. You're lonely. You've been lonely for 5 years, since Ma and Pa died, since you took on everything and never let any of it go. Dalton stopped walking so abruptly that Sully nearly ran into him. When he turned, there was something dangerous in his eyes. Not anger exactly. Something deeper and more raw than that. What do you want me to say, Sully? That I wake up every morning in a house full of people and feel like I'm the only one here. That I work myself half to death every day. And at the end of it, I sit on that porch and wonder if this is all there is. If this is all there's ever going to be. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Sully's face had gone very still. Behind him, the cabin door opened again, and Bridger Revere stepped out onto the porch. He did not come down into the yard. He simply stood there, one hand resting on the porch rail, his green eyes fixed on his brother's with the kind of watchful intensity that was his default setting. Bridger was 25, 3 years younger than Dalton, and 3 years older than Sully. He was the middle brother in every sense of the word. Not as tall as Dalton, not as warm as Sully. He existed in the space between them, quiet and observant, and carrying his own weight in silence. He spoke less than any man in the Idaho Territory, and when he did speak, people listened because they knew the words had been chosen carefully and meant something. But now, standing on the porch with the last light of the October sun, turning the sawtooth peaks behind him into molten gold, Bridger said nothing. He just watched. And somehow his silence said more than 1,000 words could have. Dalton looked away from Sully, away from Bridger, away from the cabin they had built together with their own hands after their parents had died in the winter of 1873. 5 years ago. 5 years of waking up before dawn and working until his hands bled and his back screamed and his mind went numb with exhaustion. 5 years of being the one who made all the decisions, carried all the weight, solved all the problems. 5 years of being the rock that everyone else leaned on with no one to lean on himself. And the loneliest part was not the work, it was not the responsibility, it was the silence. The bone-deep, soul-grinding silence of a man who had built his entire world so that he needed no one, and then woke up one morning to discover that needing no one and wanting no one were two very different things. "I'm fine," Dalton said finally, his voice flat. "Go back inside." Sully did not move. "You're not fine, and I'm not going anywhere." "Sully, you fired a gun at the sky and prayed for companionship." Sully's voice was gentle now, the way it got when he was trying to coax a spooked horse into a stall. "I heard you. Bridger heard you. The whole damn mountain heard you. And you know what? There's no shame in it." Dalton's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity." Sully took a step closer. "It's just, I've been thinking about something that might help." "I don't want your help." "I know, but you're getting it anyway." Dalton turned and looked at his youngest brother, really looked at him, and for the first time noticed something in Sully's expression that he had not seen before, a kind of nervous determination. The look of a man who had made a decision and was now steeling himself to follow through with it, no matter the consequences. "What did you do, Sully?" Sully's gaze slid away just for a second toward the cabin where Bridger was still standing motionless on the porch. And Dalton knew with the sick certainty of someone who has just realized they are standing on ice that is about to break, that whatever his brother had done, it was already in motion, already beyond stopping. "I wrote a letter," Sully said quietly. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and cold water and the faint metallic tang that meant snow was coming. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice thin and lonely against the vastness of the sky. Dalton stared at his brother. "What kind of letter?" "The kind that might bring you what you just prayed for." And then Sully turned and walked back to the cabin, leaving Dalton standing alone in the yard with the weight of those words settling over him like a stone. Bridger met Sully at the porch steps. The two brothers stood together for a moment, and Dalton saw Bridger's hand come up to rest briefly on Sully's shoulder. A gesture of solidarity, of shared conspiracy. And Dalton understood in that instant that Bridger had known. Whatever Sully had done, Bridger had been part of it. The door closed behind them and Dalton was alone again. He looked up at the sky at the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. The gun smoke had long since dissipated, carried away by the wind, but the echo of the shot still seemed to hang in the air. A prayer shouted into the void, a desperate plea from a man who had spent 5 years pretending he did not need anyone. He did not know it yet, but that prayer had already been answered. 4,000 miles away in a city he had never seen, a woman was packing a small bag with shaking hands and making a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Her name was Adelaide Fairbanks, and she was running for her life. Adelaide stood in the narrow servants' quarters on the third floor of the Vandermeer Mansion in Boston, trying to fit everything she owned into a traveling bag that was already too small. 2 dresses, one for travel and one for arrival, both practical and both showing their age. A pair of boots that she had resold herself because the Vandermeers did not believe in replacing things that could still technically be worn. A small leather-bound book that had belonged to her mother, the pages soft as cloth from years of reading. A silver locket with a photograph of her younger sister inside the only photograph that existed of Lily before the drowning. And $8, every cent she had managed to save in 3 years of working as a governess for the Vandermeer family. $8 between herself and absolute destitution. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely close the clasp on the bag. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that, from rage, from the kind of cold, clarifying fury that comes when a person realizes they have been pushed as far as they can be pushed, and now the only choice left is to push back or break entirely. 6 hours ago, Harrison Vandermeer had proposed marriage to her, not in the parlor surrounded by flowers and romance and the proper trappings of courtship. In the hallway outside his study with his hand on her arm and his gray eyes flat and expectant as if her answer was a foregone conclusion. "You'll marry me, Adelaide. We'll announce it at the Christmas ball." Not a question, a statement, as if she were a piece of furniture he had decided to purchase. She had looked at him, this man who was 30 years old, and heir to a shipping fortune, who had never worked a day in his life and never would. This man who had watched her teach his younger siblings for 3 years and had apparently decided that she would make a suitable ornament for his life. And she had said the only thing she could say, no. The word had hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Harrison's expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted, darkened like a cloud passing over the sun. No, he had repeated the word as if he had never heard it before, as if the concept of refusal was so foreign to him that it required translation. "I don't love you, Mr. Vandermeer, and I won't marry a man I don't love." That was when he had hit her, not hard enough to knock her down, just hard enough to snap her head to the side and leave a red handprint blooming across her cheek. Hard enough to make his point, that in this house, in his world, he was the one who made decisions. Not her, never her. "You owe us everything," he had said, his voice perfectly calm, as if he had just corrected a child's arithmetic instead of striking a woman half his size. "We took you in when you had nothing, gave you a roof, an education, a position. You'll marry me or you'll have nothing again. Do you understand?" She had understood. She had understood with perfect crystalline clarity. She had understood that if she stayed in this house one more day, she would spend the rest of her life being owned by a man who thought of her as property. And she had made her choice right there in the hallway, with the taste of blowing it in her mouth and the sting of his hand still burning on her cheek. She would rather have nothing than be owned. Now in the small room that had been her prison for 3 years, Adelaide finished packing the bag and moved to the window. The sun was setting over Boston, turning the brick buildings and cobblestone streets into shades of amber and shadow. She had lived in this city her entire life. Her parents had died here of typhoid when she was 19. Her sister had drowned here in the Charles River when Adelaide was 17 and should have been watching her, but had gone to a party instead. She had failed Lily. She had failed to save her, and she had carried that guilt for 5 years like a stone tied around her neck, dragging her down into a kind of numbness that made it easy to accept whatever life handed her. Easy to become a governess. Easy to let the Vandermeers treat her like an afterthought. Easy to say yes to things she should have said no to because, what did it matter? Lily was dead and nothing Adelaide did would ever bring her back. But tonight, looking out at the city where she had lost everything, Adelaide felt something she had not felt in 5 years. She felt anger, clean and sharp and clarifying, and beneath the anger, something even more dangerous. Hope. On the small desk beside the window lay a newspaper folded open to the classified section. And in that section, circled in pencil, was an advertisement that Adelaide had read so many times she could recite it from memory. Mail order brides wanted, Wyoming and Idaho territories. Honest work, honest men, honest living. Write to the addresses below. There were dozens of addresses listed, ranchers and miners and shopkeepers all looking for wives in a place where women were scarce and loneliness was abundant. Adelaide had written to 3 of them over the past 2 weeks, carefully secretly in the hours after the Vandermeer children had gone to bed. and one of them had written back, Sullivan Revere, Coal Ridge, Idaho Territory. The letter was tucked inside her bag, now folded carefully into quarters. She had read it so many times that the creases were starting to split. It was not flowery, it was not romantic, but it was honest in a way that nothing in her Boston life had been honest in years. I won't promise you an easy life, Miss Fairbanks. Idaho winters can kill a person, and a ranch in the mountains is not a tea parlor in Boston. But I promise you truth, respect, in a place where you will never need to pretend to be someone you are not. If that is good enough for you, then you are good enough for us. Us, not me. And that had caught her attention, that small word. As if Sullivan Revere understood that a life was not built by two people in isolation, but by a family, a community, a network of connections that made survival possible in a place as unforgiving as the frontier. Adelaide did not know that the letter had been written by a man who was trying to save his brother. She did not know that Sullivan Revere was 22 years old and had no intention of marrying her himself. She did not know that the us in that letter referred to three brothers on a mountain, one of whom had just fired a gun at the sky and begged God for an answer. All she knew was that the letter had felt like a door opening in a wall she had thought was solid. And now she was going to walk through that door even if she had no idea what was on the other side. She picked up the bag, took one last look at the room that had been her cage, and walked out without looking back. The train ticket from Boston to Cheyenne cost $6.50. The stagecoach from Cheyenne to Coleridge was supposed to cost another $1.25. That would leave her with 25 cents and whatever faith she could muster that the man who had written that letter was telling the truth. It was not much, but it was more than she had staying here. Adelaide Fairbanks walked out of the Vandermeer mansion at midnight with a bag in her hand and a prayer on her lips that she did not fully believe in, and stepped into the October night. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs. The streets were empty except for a few late carriages rattling over the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was ringing the hour, each chime echoing across the sleeping city like a countdown. She did not look back, not once, because looking back meant remembering everything she was leaving behind. And if she did that, she might lose her nerve, might talk herself into going back into accepting Harrison's proposal and to living the rest of her life as something less than human. So she looked forward instead, toward the train station, toward the west, toward a man named Sullivan Revere who had promised her truth and respect and a place to belong. Behind her in the darkness of the Vandermeer mansion, Harrison stood at his study window and watched her go. His face was expressionless, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He had underestimated her. He had thought that the threat of poverty would be enough to bring her to heel. He had thought she would come crawling back within a day, begging for forgiveness, ready to accept his terms. He had thought wrong. Harrison Vandermeer was not a man who tolerated being wrong, and he was not a man who accepted rejection. Not from business partners, not from competitors, and certainly not from a penniless governess who should have been grateful for his attention. He would let her run, let her think she had escaped, let her get halfway across the country before he made his move. Because when he came for her and he would come for her, she would understand something very important. No one left Harrison Vandermeer. Not until he said so. The train carried Adelaide west through a landscape that changed with every passing mile. The brick and stone of Boston gave way to the farmland of Pennsylvania, then the wide plains of the Midwest, then the impossible vastness of the territories. 4 days on hard wooden seats, sleeping in snatches with her bag clutched to her chest, eating bread and cheese that she had brought from Boston because she could not afford the dining car. By the time the train pulled into Cheyenne, Adelaide was exhausted and filthy and more terrified than she had ever been in her life. But she was also, for the first time in 5 years, free. The stagecoach to Coleridge was supposed to leave at 2 in the afternoon. Adelaide bought her ticket with shaking hands, watched the clerk count out her change, and realized with a sick lurch in her stomach that she now had exactly 25 cents to her name. $0.25, the price of a loaf of bread. She sat on a bench outside the station and tried not to think about what would happen if Sullivan Revere turned out to be a liar or a monster or simply someone who had changed his mind. Tried not to think about the fact that she had burned every bridge behind her and was now standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go but forward. The stagecoach left on time, rattling out of Cheyenne with Adelaide and three other passengers crammed inside. Two miners heading to the Silver Claims and a salesman with a sample case full of patent medicines. None of them spoke to her. She was grateful for that. She did not want to make conversation. She wanted to disappear into herself, into the rhythm of the coach wheels on the dirt road, into the landscape rolling past the windows. Idaho Territory in October was the most beautiful thing Adelaide had ever seen. Mountains that rose up like cathedral spires, their peaks already white with snow. Forests so thick and dark that they looked like something out of a fairy tale. Meadows of golden grass that rippled in the wind like waves on an ocean. And the sky, God, the sky, wide and blue and endless, in a way that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and profoundly connected to something larger than herself. She had lived her entire life in a city where the buildings blocked out the sun and the smoke from 1,000 chimneys turned the air gray. She had never seen stars that were not dimmed by gaslight and pollution. She had never breathed air that did not taste like coal dust and human waste. This was different. This was clean and wild and utterly alien. And Adelaide realized somewhere between Cheyenne and Coleridge that she had made either the best decision of her life or the worst. There would be no middle ground. The stagecoach broke an axle 12 miles outside of Coleridge. The driver climbed down, bumped into the damage, and delivered his verdict with the kind of resigned irritation that suggested this happened more often than passengers would like to think. Day and a half to fix it, maybe two. You folks can wait here or you can walk to town. Your choice. The two miners chose to wait. The salesman chose to wait. Adelaide looked at the empty road stretching westward at the mountains rising in the distance and made a decision that would have horrified anyone with an ounce of common sense. I'll walk. The driver looked at her like she had just announced her intention to sprout wings and fly. Miss, it's 12 miles, in October, with no shade and no water stations. I've walked 12 miles before, Adelaide lied. The farthest she had ever walked in her life was maybe 3 miles on a pleasant spring day in Boston, wearing sensible shoes and carrying nothing heavier than a parasol. But she could not wait. Could not sit on the side of this road for a day and a half with nothing to do but think about all the ways this plan could go wrong. Could not give herself time to talk herself out of the insane thing she was doing. So she picked up her bag, thanked the driver for his concern, and started walking. For the first 2 miles, it was not so bad. The weather was warm but not unbearable. Her boots were worn but serviceable. The bag was light enough that she could switch it from hand to hand when one arm got tired. By mile 4, the blisters had started. By mile 6, her water was gone. By mile 8, she was starting to see things that were not there. Shadows that moved when she blinked. The sound of her sister's voice calling her name from somewhere behind her. By mile 10, Adelaide Fairbanks was no longer walking in a straight line. She was weaving, stumbling, her vision graying at the edges. The bag felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Her throat was so dry that swallowing felt like swallowing broken glass. And then somewhere around mile 11, her legs simply stopped obeying her brain. She took one more step, and then another, and then the ground came up to meet her face, and she was lying in the red Idaho dust, with the October sun beating down on her back and the taste of blood and dirt in her mouth. Her last conscious thought was not of Sullivan Revere, or the ranch she was supposed to reach, or the life she was trying to build. It was a prayer, the same prayer Dalton had shouted at the sky a week ago, though she did not know that. God, if you're there, let someone find me. Let me belong somewhere. And then the darkness came up and swallowed her whole. Henry Walsh found her 2 hours later. He was a freight driver, 53 years old, and weathered as an old boot hauling supplies from Cheyenne to the mining camps in ranches scattered across the Idaho mountains. He had been driving this route for 20 years, and in all that time he had seen some strange things. But he had never seen a woman lying unconscious in the middle of the road in a navy blue dress that was clearly made for a Boston drawing room and not an Idaho wilderness. He stopped. His wagon climbed down and checked her pulse. Still alive, burning with fever, her face flushed, and her breathing shallow but alive. Henry was not a man given to sentiment or grand gestures, but he was a decent man, and decency meant you did not leave a woman to die on the side of the road just because helping her was inconvenient. So he lifted Adelaide Fairbanks into the back of his wagon, laid her gently among the sacks of flour and crates of supplies, and made a decision. The Revere Ranch was the closest habitation, 7 miles north up a mountain road that was more suggestion than actual road but close enough. The town of Coleridge was another 5 miles past that, and the doctor, assuming there was a doctor in town at all, was probably out making calls and would not be back for days. So Henry pointed his horses north and drove. The sun was setting by the time he rattled into the yard of the Revere Ranch, and the first thing he saw was 3 men emerging from the barn with the kind of alertness that suggested they had heard the wagon coming from a mile away and were ready for trouble. The tallest one, the one who had to be Dalton Revere, because no one else in Idaho was that size, reached the wagon first. He looked up at Henry with amber eyes that were sharp as broken glass and said one word. "What?" Henry jerked his thumb toward the back of the wagon. "Found her on the Coleridge Road, collapsed. Fever, needs help." Dalton did not wait for further explanation. He climbed into the wagon bed and looked down at the unconscious woman lying among the supplies. And something in his face changed. Not softened exactly, but shifted, as if some door he had been holding shut had just cracked open, despite his best efforts. She was small, maybe 5 feet 3 inches thin, in a way that suggested not fashion but genuine hardship. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins and was plastered to her face with sweat. Her dress was torn and filthy, the hem black with road dust. And on her face, even in unconsciousness, there was a kind of stubborn determination that Dalton recognized because he saw it in the mirror every morning. He slid his arms beneath her and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, or maybe it just felt that way because the urgency made her seem weightless. Her head fell against his shoulder, and Dalton could feel the heat radiating through the fabric of her dress. The fever was bad. Dangerously bad. "Sully," he called over his shoulder, not looking away from the woman in his arms. "Get water boiling, 3 pots, now." Sully was already moving, running toward the cabin. Bridger appeared beside the wagon, his green eyes taking in the scene with his usual silent assessment. He did not ask questions. He simply moved ahead of Dalton, opening the cabin door, clearing the table of the dinner dishes they had not yet washed. "Put her on your bed," Henry Walsh said from the driver's seat. "She needs to be lying down elevated cool compresses." Dalton carried Adelaide into the cabin and through to his bedroom, the only bedroom on the ground floor. The room he had built himself 5 years ago when he still thought he might someday share it with someone. He laid her on the bed on the quilt his mother had sewn before the typhoid took her, and for a moment he just stood there, looking down at this stranger who had appeared in his life like an answer to a question he had been too afraid to ask. Sully came in with the first pot of boiling water and stopped in the doorway, his eyes going wide. Then his gaze dropped to the bag that Henry had brought in and set beside the bed. The bag that was hanging open just enough to reveal a folded piece of paper tucked inside. Sully crossed the room, reached into the bag, and pulled out the paper. He unfolded it slowly, his face going pale as he recognized his own handwriting, his own words. The letter he had written 6 weeks ago to a woman in Boston, Massachusetts. He handed the letter to Dalton without saying a word. Dalton read it, read every word he had supposedly written, every promise he had supposedly made. And when he was finished, he looked up at his youngest brother with an expression that could have melted steel. "What," Dalton said, his voice dangerously quiet, "did you do?" The silence in that bedroom was the kind that precedes violence. Dalton stood with the letter in his hand, his amber eyes locked on his youngest brother, and for a moment Sully genuinely believed that Dalton might hit him. Not out of cruelty, but out of the sheer overwhelming rage of a man who has just discovered that his entire life has been interfered with by someone who thought they knew better. But then Adelaide moaned a soft sound of pain that cut through the tension like a knife, and Dalton's attention snapped back to her. Because whatever fury he felt towards Sully, whatever betrayal he was processing, the woman on his bed was dying. And Dalton Revere did not let people die. Not if he could help it. Not ever again. He turned to Henry Walsh, who was standing in the doorway looking uncomfortable. What does she need? Henry stepped into the room, his weathered face grave. Water first, small amounts. Don't let her drink too much too fast, or she'll just bring it back up. Cool compresses for the fever. Willow bark tea if you have it. And time. She needs time to fight this. How much time? 2 days. 3. Depends on how strong she is. Dalton looked down at Adelaide again, at her pale face and cracked lips, and the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. She walked 12 miles in October heat with no water. She's strong enough. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. And Henry, who had seen enough of life to recognize certainty when he heard it, simply nodded and left to get Cora Pritchett, Adelaide's aunt, who lived near Coleridge, and who Henry remembered had some nursing experience from the war. The moment Henry was gone, Sully spoke. His voice was quiet, almost pleading. Dalton, I can explain. Not now. Dalton did not look at him. He was already moving to the wash basin, wringing out a cloth in the cool water. Right now, she needs help. We'll talk about what you did later. But later, the word came out like a whip crack. Final. Absolute. Sully left. Bridger remained in the doorway for a moment longer, his green eyes moving between his eldest brother and the unconscious woman on the bed. Then he too withdrew, though not far. He positioned himself in the main room of the cabin within earshot, ready to help if needed. That was Bridger's way. Silent, watchful, always ready. Dalton pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. He laid the cool compress across Adelaide's forehead the way Henry had instructed and watched the water darken as it absorbed the heat from her skin. She was burning up. The fever had turned her face red, made her breathing ragged and desperate. He changed the compress, changed it again and again. Every 15 minutes through the night, wringing out the cloth in fresh, cool water, laying it gently across her forehead, her neck, her wrists, where the pulse beat fast and frantic beneath skin that felt like it might catch fire. Cora Pritchett arrived at near midnight, a solid woman in her late 40s with her dead sister's blue eyes and a no-nonsense efficiency that Dalton found deeply reassuring. She took one look at Adelaide, felt her pulse, checked her breathing, and immediately took charge. Willow bark tea, she said. Every 2 hours, force it down if you have to, but get it into her. And keep those compresses coming. The fever breaks or it kills her. Those are the only 2 outcomes now. Dalton made the tea himself, grinding the bark with the butt of his knife handle, steeping it in boiling water until the liquid turned dark and bitter. When it had cooled enough not to burn, he cradled Adelaide's head with one hand and brought the cup to her lips with the other. Drink, he said softly. I know it tastes like hell, but you need to drink. She did not wake. But some instinct deeper than consciousness responded to the water, to the voice, to the gentle insistence. Her lips parted slightly, and Dalton tipped the cup, letting a few drops slide into her mouth. She swallowed reflexively. He gave her a little more, then a little more. It took 20 minutes to get half a cup into her, but he did it, and then he set the cup aside, laid her head back on the pillow, and prepared to do it again in 2 hours. Cora watched all of this from the corner of the room, her expression unreadable. You're good at this. Dalton did not take his eyes off Adelaide. I've nursed sick cattle through bad winters. Same principle. She's not a cow, Mr. Revere. No, she's not. A pause. Then Cora said very quietly, she's my niece, Eleanor's daughter. My sister died of typhoid 5 years ago. Adelaide was supposed to write me, let me know she was safe in Boston. She never did. I thought, her voice caught. I thought maybe she didn't want anything to do with her Western relatives. Thought maybe she was ashamed of us. Dalton finally looked up, met Cora's eyes. She's not ashamed. She's running. From what? I don't know yet, but when she wakes up, we'll find out. The first night was the worst. Adelaide's fever spiked near dawn, climbing so high that even Cora looked worried. She started thrashing, caught in nightmares that Dalton could not see but could hear in the fragments of words she spoke. Lily, I'm sorry. Lily, I'm sorry. Don't, please don't. I'll do anything. Please just don't. Each broken plea landed like a physical blow. Dalton found himself leaning closer, his hand covering hers where it clutched at the quilt. You're safe, he said, knowing she could not hear him but saying it anyway. You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. Bridger appeared in the doorway sometime around 3 in the morning. He did not say anything. He just stood there, a silent presence, and somehow that was exactly what Dalton needed. The reminder that he was not alone in this, that his brothers were here, even if one of them had just committed the most spectacular betrayal of trust Dalton could imagine. By the second day, the fever had not broken, but it had stopped climbing. Adelaide lay still and pale against the pillows, her breathing a little easier, her pulse a little stronger. Dalton had not left the room except to use the outhouse. He ate the food that Sully brought him without tasting it. He drank the coffee that Bridger set on the nightstand without really registering the caffeine. All of his focus was on the woman in his bed, on the rise and fall of her chest, on the flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers when he checked it every hour. Cora came and went, bringing fresh water, clean cloths, more willow bark. She did not ask questions. She just worked alongside Dalton in a companionable silence that he found oddly comforting. On the afternoon of the second day, Adelaide's eyes opened. Just for a moment, long enough for Dalton to see that they were blue, cornflower blue, the color of summer sky over the sawtooth peaks. She looked at him without recognition, without understanding, her gaze unfocused and confused. Where? My ranch, Dalton said gently. About 15 miles from Coleridge. A freight driver found you on the road and brought you here. She tried to sit up. He pressed her shoulder, gentle but firm, keeping her down. Don't. You've been sick. You need to rest. Why would you help me? Her voice was barely a whisper, dry and cracked like old leather. Because that's what decent people do. Something flickered across her face, not gratitude. Suspicion? In my experience, decent people always want something in return. What do you want? The question hit him like a slap, not because it was rude, but because it was honest. Because it revealed in a single sentence exactly what kind of life this woman had lived. A life where kindness came with a price tag, where help was never free. I want you to get well, Dalton said. That's all. She studied his face for a long moment, those blue eyes searching for the lie, the catch, the hidden cost. Then her strength gave out and her eyes closed again. But not before Dalton saw the tears gathering at the corners, the wetness that she was trying desperately not to let fall. He reached for the water pitcher and poured a fresh cup. When he looked back, she was watching him again. There was something in her expression now that had not been there before. Not trust, dishonesty, but maybe the faintest possibility of it. Thirsty, she whispered. Dalton slid his hand beneath her head, cradling it as he brought the cup to her lips. His hand was huge compared to her skull, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of hard work. The kind of hand that could kill a man or gentle a frightened animal. And he held her head as if she were made of glass, as if the slightest wrong move might break her. Adelaide drank the whole cup, and when she was finished, she looked up at him with an expression that was part gratitude and part wonder, as if she could not quite believe that someone was being kind to her without demanding payment. More soon, Dalton promised, but not yet. Too much too fast, and you'll be sick. She nodded slightly. Her eyes drifted closed. And this time when she slept, it was not the restless, fevered sleep of before, but something deeper. Something that looked almost peaceful. Dalton sat back in his chair and allowed himself for the first time in 48 hours to breathe. The fever broke in the early hours of the third morning. Dalton woke from a doze in his chair to find Adelaide watching him in the pale gray light that filtered through the window before dawn. The flush was gone from her face, replaced by a more natural pallor. Her eyes were clear and alert. "Hello," she said softly. There was embarrassment in her voice, the kind that comes from being helpless in front of strangers. Dalton stood quickly, his back protesting after 3 nights in a wooden chair. How are you feeling? Like someone who walked through a desert in October without enough water. A faint smile crossed her face, which is exactly what I did. Foolish of me. You're alive, that's what matters. Adelaide pushed herself up to sitting, wincing slightly. Dalton moved to help her, but she waved him off with a small gesture that said she wanted to do it herself. He understood. Dignity mattered, especially when everything else had been stripped away. She looked around the room, taking in the rough-hewn log walls, the simple furniture, the window that framed a view of mountains that probably looked like something from another planet to a woman from Boston. This is your room? Yes. Where have you been sleeping? Out there. He jerked his head toward the main room, the chair, the floor. Doesn't matter. You gave me your bed. She said it like an accusation. You were dying. You needed a bed more than I did. Adelaide was quiet for a moment, her hands smoothing the quilt over her lap. The quilt was old, faded, but beautifully made. The work of someone who had cared about the details. Your mother made this. It was not a question. Somehow she just knew. Dalton nodded. She was a good woman, I think, to raise a son who would give a stranger his bed. Dalton felt something tighten in his chest. She died 5 years ago. Typhoid. My father went 2 weeks later. Same thing. Adelaide looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw recognition. Not just sympathy, understanding. The kind that only comes from having lost people the same way. My parents died of typhoid too, 5 years ago, in Boston. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was the silence of two people who had just discovered they spoke the same language of grief. Then Adelaide spoke again, and her voice was different now, harder. The letter in my bag, the one from Sullivan Revere. I need to know if it was real. Dalton's jaw tightened. The letter is real. The man who wrote it is real. But there's something you need to know. Tell me. Sullivan Revere is my brother, not me. And he wrote that letter without asking me, without telling me. He wrote it because... Dalton stopped, the words catching in his throat. Because why? Adelaide's voice was gentle but insistent. Because I'm lonely. Because I fired a gun at the sky 3 weeks ago and prayed for companionship. Because he heard me and decided to help God answer that prayer. The admission came out bitter angry. Not at Adelaide, at himself, at the vulnerability of having been so desperate that his brother felt the need to intervene. Adelaide absorbed this information with surprising calm. So you didn't know I was coming? No. And you didn't ask for a mail-order bride? No. But you want one. Dalton met her eyes. I don't know what I want, but I know you didn't come here to be part of some scheme you didn't agree to. So I'm giving you a choice. You can stay until you're strong enough to decide what you want. You'll have your own room. No one will touch you. No obligations beyond what you choose. And if you decide to leave, we'll help you get wherever you want to go. Adelaide tilted her head, studying him. And if I decide to stay, then we'll figure it out together. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers still smoothing the quilt, her mind clearly working through all the angles, all the possibilities, and all the ways this could go wrong. Finally, she said, I have 25 cents to my name, Mr. Revere. I burned every bridge I had in Boston. I have nowhere else to go. So I think we both know that my choices here are pretty limited. That doesn't mean you don't have a choice, Dalton said quietly. You always have a choice. Do I? It was not really a question. It was a challenge. And Dalton realized in that moment that Adelaide Fairbanks was not going to be easy. She was not going to be docile or grateful or any of the things that a man might expect from a mail-order bride who had been rescued from the side of a road. She was going to be difficult, stubborn, independent. She was going to question everything and demand honesty at every turn. And somehow that made him respect her more than anything else could have. Yes, he said, you do. By mid-morning, Adelaide was strong enough to sit at the kitchen table. Cora had brought clean clothes, simple dresses that were too big but serviceable. Adelaide's honey blonde hair was brushed and pinned, though still damp from the washing Cora had helped her with. She looked small in the big chair, but her back was straight and her eyes were alert. Sully and Bridger sat across from her, both of them radiating different kinds of tension. Sully looked nervous, guilty, hopeful. Bridger looked watchful, assessing, ready for anything. Dalton stood by the stove, arms crossed, and addressed his brothers without looking at Adelaide. She deserves an explanation, the whole truth, from both of you. Sully swallowed hard. Then, to his credit, he did not make excuses. He laid it out plainly. The trip to Boston 3 months ago to buy breeding horses, meeting Adelaide at the Vandermeer mansion when he went to negotiate the sale with Harrison. The way she had been kind to him when the Vandermeers had treated him like dirt on their boots. The realization that she was wasted in that house, trapped in a life that was slowly killing her spirit. And then the decision, the letter, the plan to find his brother a wife because Dalton would never find one for himself. When Sully finished, the silence in the kitchen was absolute. Adelaide spoke first. "You met me in Boston." "Yes, ma'am." "And you decided based on one meeting that I would be suitable for your brother." "Not suitable. Perfect." Sully's voice was earnest. "You were kind. You were smart. You asked me about Idaho like you actually cared about the answer. And I could see that you were dying in that house, same way Dalton was dying on this mountain. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought maybe you could save each other." Adelaide turned to Bridger. "And you knew about this?" Bridger nodded once. "Did you approve?" Another nod. Then, because the moment seemed to require actual words, Bridger said, "Dalton needs someone. You need somewhere," made sense. "Made sense," Adelaide repeated. She looked at Dalton. "And you? Are you angry with them?" "Yes." "Are you going to forgive them?" "Eventually." "Why?" "Because they're family, and family forgives." Adelaide stood up from the table. All three brothers tensed, unsure what she was about to do. She crossed the room until she was standing directly in front of Dalton, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. "Mr. Revere, do you want me to stay?" Dalton looked down at her, at this small, fierce woman who had walked herself into heat exhaustion rather than wait, who had looked at him with suspicion even when he was trying to save her life, who was now demanding honesty with a directness that most men would not have had the courage for. "Yes," he said, "I want you to stay." "Why?" "Because I'm tired of being alone, and because I think you are too." Adelaide held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then I'll stay, on these conditions. I get my own room, I cook and manage the house. You teach me how to survive out here. No one touches me without my permission. No obligations beyond what I agree to. And if I change my mind, you let me go without argument. Do we have an agreement?" Dalton held out his hand. It dwarfed hers when she took it, her small fingers disappearing into his calloused palm. "We have an agreement." They shook. And in that moment, something shifted in the cabin, something that felt almost like hope. The next 2 weeks were an education in humility for Adelaide Fairbanks. Everything she thought she knew about life turned out to be useless on a mountain ranch in Idaho. She could not cook on a wood stove. She could not gather eggs without being attacked by angry hens. She could not ride a horse without falling off. She could not chop wood or mend fences or tell the difference between a deer track and an elk track. But she could learn, and she did. Sully taught her to ride patient and cheerful even when she fell off for the fourth time in one afternoon. He picked her up off the ground with a trace of mockery in his warm amber eyes. "Boston girl," he said, grinning. "A horse is not a carriage. It has opinions of its own." Adelaide laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving in Idaho, maybe the first time she had laughed in months. The sound carried across the yard to where Dalton was repairing a fence post 50 yards away. He stopped hammering, was raised, and something about that laugh made the tightness in his chest ease by a fraction. Bridger taught her to read the wilderness. He showed her bear tracks in the mud by the creek. showed her the difference between a rattlesnake and a harmless garter snake, taught her which sounds in the forest were normal and which meant danger. When she asked how he knew so much, he answered with his typical brevity, "The mountain teaches, if you live long enough to learn." And Dalton taught her without seeming to teach at all. He showed her how to split wood by letting her watch him do it, then handing her a smaller axe and letting her try. He showed her how to read weather by pointing out the clouds that meant snow was coming. He showed her where the best trout pools were in the creek by taking her there one evening and letting her watch the fish rise to the surface at dusk. He did not coddle her, did not treat her like she was fragile, and Adelaide found herself grateful for that in a way she could not quite articulate. The Vandermeers had treated her like a pretty breakable thing. Dalton treated her like a person capable of learning, of growing, of becoming strong. The first snow came in late November. Bridger saw it coming 2 days before it arrived, reading signs in the sky and the behavior of the animals that Adelaide was just beginning to recognize. "Storm," he said at breakfast. "Bad one tomorrow." The preparation was like a military operation. Dalton and Bridger rode out to move the cattle to a sheltered canyon on the lee side of the ridge. Sully reinforced the barn, hammering loose boards and spreading extra hay for the horses. And Adelaide worked. She hauled firewood armload after armload from the woodpile to the storage inside. The logs were heavy, heavier than anything she had carried in Boston, and her arms were shaking by the 10th trip. But she did not stop. She chased chickens into the coop, getting pecked twice and cursing under her breath in language she had picked up in Boston drawing rooms. She filled every pot and bucket in the house with water from the well in case they could not get outside for days. When Dalton and Bridger came back at dusk, half frozen and exhausted, they found hot soup waiting on the stove, and Adelaide standing at the window watching the first flakes begin to fall. They sat around the kitchen table, all four of them, and ate in the kind of comfortable silence that comes from shared work. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the shutters, promising a long night. But inside the cabin was warm. The fire was blazing. The soup was good. And for the first time since Adelaide had arrived, the cabin felt like something more than a house. It felt like a home. Bridger finished his soup and set down his spoon. He looked at his bowl for a moment, then said 2 words. "Good soup." Sully nearly choked on his coffee. Bridger Revere just complimented cooking. Someone write this down. Adelaide smiled a real smile that reached her eyes. And Dalton, watching from across the table, felt something shift inside him. Something that had been locked down tight for 5 years beginning to crack open. The storm lasted 3 days. By the second day, the snow was 4 feet deep, and they could not see the barn from the cabin windows. They were trapped inside together, 4 people who had been strangers a month ago, learning to exist in close quarters without driving each other insane. Adelaide taught Sully to read better using her mother's book as a textbook. He was slow, sounding out syllables like a boy, but he was determined. And Adelaide was patient with him in a way that made Dalton realize she must have been a good governess back in Boston, the kind who actually cared whether her students learned. Bridger sat in the corner and carved his knife, moving in steady, rhythmic strokes against the pine. He was making a small bird wing spread in flight for no reason except that his hands needed to be busy. He did not join the reading lessons, but he listened, and occasionally when Sully stumbled over a particularly difficult word, Bridger would say it quietly from his corner, helping without making it obvious. And Dalton sat by the fire and watched all of this, feeling something he had not felt in so long that he had almost forgotten what it was called. Contentment, the sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be with the people he was supposed to be with. On the third night, when the storm had finally blown itself out and the stars were visible again through the clearing clouds, Dalton found Adelaide standing on the porch wrapped in one of his old coats because she had not brought anything warm enough for Idaho winters. "You should be inside," he said. "Wait, it's freezing out here." "I know, but look at the stars." She gestured up at the sky, at the impossible brightness of the Milky Way stretching overhead like a river of light. "I've never seen anything like that. In Boston, the city lights drown everything out. But here," she stopped, searching for words, "here you can see forever." Dalton stood beside her close enough that he could feel the cold radiating off her coat, far enough that they were not touching. It's easy to forget how beautiful it is when you see it every night. Thank you for reminding me. They stood in silence for a while watching the stars. Then Adelaide said very quietly, I'm glad I stayed. So am I. She looked up at him. Her face was pale in the starlight, her eyes dark and serious. I want you to know something. I didn't come here looking for charity, and I'm not going to be a burden. I'm going to pull my weight. I'm going to be useful. You already are. I burn biscuits and fall off horses. You also saved Sully's pride by teaching him to read without making him feel stupid. You kept us all fed during a blizzard. You're learning faster than anyone I've ever seen. He paused. You're not a burden, Adelaide. He stopped because the word he wanted to say was essential, but that felt like too much too soon. Adelaide waited. When he did not continue, she said, I'm what? You're exactly what this place needed, what we needed. She smiled then, a small private smile that made his heart do something complicated in his chest. Good, because I think maybe I needed you too. She went back inside before he could respond, leaving him standing on the porch with the cold wind and the stars and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that he was falling in love with a woman who had been a stranger 4 weeks ago. Inside, Sully caught his eye and grinned. Dalton shook his head, but he could not quite suppress the smile that was trying to break through. Bridger from his corner carved his wooden bird and said nothing. But there was something in his expression that might have been satisfaction, as if the plan he and Sully had set in motion was finally bearing fruit. And maybe it was. The bear came on a clear December morning when the air was so cold it burned to breathe. Adelaide was alone by the chicken coop gathering eggs in the wicker basket Cora had given her, moving carefully because the hens had finally started to tolerate her presence, and she did not want to ruin that fragile peace. The sun was bright on the new snow, making everything sparkle like the whole world had been dusted with ground glass. She heard the sound before she saw the source. A heavy shuffling, the crack of a branch, the low rumble of breath. Adelaide turned the basket still in her hands and froze. The black bear stood 30 feet away at the edge of the tree line. Not a grizzly, but big enough. Maybe 300 pounds, young and curious, drawn by the smell of grain and chickens and easy food. Its small eyes fixed on Adelaide, and she watched as its nostrils flared, testing the air, trying to decide if she was a threat or just another part of the landscape. Every instinct Adelaide possessed screamed at her to run, to drop the basket and sprint for the cabin and slam the door behind her. But something in the way the bear was watching her, something in the tension of its muscles, told her that running would be the worst possible thing she could do. That running would transform her from a confusing obstacle into prey. So she stood perfectly still, the basket clutched to her chest, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She could not breathe, could not move, could not do anything but stare at this creature that could kill her without even trying very hard. The bear took a step forward, then another, and then Dalton was there. He came from the barn like something out of a nightmare or a dream, depending on your perspective. Moving fast, but not running, because running would spook the bear the same way it would spook Adelaide. He positioned himself between Adelaide and the animal, his body a wall, a barrier, a statement that said very clearly, you will not touch her. Then he spread his arms wide, making himself as large as possible. All 6 feet 5 inches of him, his wingspan enormous. His presence suddenly overwhelming in a way that had nothing to do with kindness or gentleness and everything to do with pure physical dominance. And he roared. The sound came from somewhere deep in his chest, primal and massive, a sound that seemed to shake the air itself. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of something bigger and more dangerous than the bear could hope to be, and the message was unmistakable. Leave. Now. Or find out what happens when you challenge something that will not back down. The bear hesitated for just a moment, its small brain processing this new information. Then it wheeled around and crashed back into the forest branches, snapping under its weight, the sound of its retreat fading quickly into the silence of the mountains. Dalton stood there for a long moment, arms still spread, making sure the bear was truly gone. Then he turned and Adelaide saw his face. The careful control he usually maintained had cracked, revealing something underneath that she had not seen before. Fear. Not for himself, for her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, urgent. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and his hands came up to her shoulders, gripping her just firmly enough to check that she was real, that she was whole, that she was here. Adelaide could not speak. The adrenaline was hitting her now, making her legs shake, making her vision blur at the edges. She shook her head mutely. "You're sure it didn't touch you?" "No, you stopped it." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Dalton's hands were still on her shoulders, big hands warm even through the fabric of her coat. And Adelaide realized with a clarity that cut through the fear that they were standing very close. Close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes, the small scar on his jaw from some long ago accident, the way his breath misted in the cold air between them. "I heard the noise and I ran. I didn't think. I just ran." He was still breathing hard, his chest rising and falling. "If something had happened to you," he stopped. Because finishing that sentence meant admitting something he was not ready to admit. Something they had been dancing around for weeks now. Both of them too careful, too wounded by their past to say it out loud. Adelaide looked up at him, her blue eyes met his amber ones and held. "Nothing happened because you were here." The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric. Dalton's hands were still on her shoulders. Adelaide's face was tilted up toward his. 6 inches separated them, maybe less. It would have been so easy to close that distance, so easy to let this moment become something more. But Dalton pulled back, dropped his hands, stepped away, putting space between them, like he was physically forcing himself to retreat. "Don't go out alone," he said, his voice rougher than it needed to be. "Not yet. Not until we're sure it won't come back." Then he turned and walked toward the barn fast, like something was chasing him. And Adelaide stood there with the basket of eggs still clutched to her chest, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the bear. After that morning, things changed. Small things at first. Dalton started cutting his hair neater, shaving more regularly, changing into a clean shirt before dinner. Every evening when he rode back from checking the cattle on the upper pasture, he brought wildflowers. Not elaborate bouquets, just a few stems. Whatever was blooming despite the cold. Wintergreen, late aster, the last stubborn columbine clinging to life in the sheltered spots. He never said anything when he left them on the windowsill of Adelaide's room. Never mentioned them at all. But every morning she would wake to find them there, a silent message that he was thinking about her. Sully noticed immediately and nearly made a comment at breakfast, but Bridger kicked him under the table before the words could form. Hard enough to leave a bruise. Sully glared but kept his mouth shut. Adelaide, for her part, began transforming the cabin. She sewed curtains from fabric bought in Coleridge, spending her own money that Cora had lent her. She made cushions for the hard wooden chairs. She found the one remaining photograph of Dalton's parents, carefully framed it in a wooden border that Sully carved, and hung it on the wall of the main room where everyone could see it. When Dalton saw his parents' faces on the wall, he stood very still for a long time. 5 minutes, maybe more. He did not speak, did not move, just stood there looking at the photograph, at the faces he had tried so hard not to forget, but that had been fading from memory despite his best efforts. That evening, the wildflowers on Adelaide's windowsill were larger than any before. A whole handful of wintergreen, the white blooms pristine against the dark leaves. The first real argument came in early January when Cora invited Adelaide to stay with her in Coleridge for a week. "Just to give you a break from all that testosterone," Cora had said with a wry smile, "and to let the neighbors see you're alive and well and not being held prisoner by 3 mountain men." Dalton's response had been immediate and unequivocal. "No." Adelaide looked at him across the dinner table, her eyebrows rising. "Excuse me, it's not safe. The roads are bad, the snow. You should stay here." "The roads are fine. Cora got here without any trouble." and I'm perfectly capable of spending a week with my aunt. That's not what I meant. Dalton's jaw was set in that stubborn line she was beginning to recognize. People will talk. A single woman living with three unmarried men. It's not proper. I don't care what people think. Well, you should. Reputation matters out here. Adelaide set down her fork very carefully. Her voice went quiet, but there was steel underneath it. Mr. Revere, I spent my entire life in Boston living by other people's rules, doing what was proper, being what they expected me to be. I came here to be free of that. So if you think I'm going to start worrying about propriety, now you're mistaken. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection from gossip. I need to not be a burden on you and your brothers. I need to know that I have somewhere else I can go, people I can see a life beyond this cabin. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Sully and Bridger had both stopped eating, their eyes moving between Adelaide and Dalton like spectators at a prize fight. Then Dalton spoke, and his voice was softer than it had been. You're not a burden, Adelaide. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that made her anger drain away. Not submission, understanding. He was afraid that if she left even for a week, she might decide not to come back. Then don't decide for me, she said gentler now. Ask me what I want. What do you want? I want to visit my aunt for a few days, and then I want to come back here because this is where I belong now. Dalton held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded once. All right. They drove to Coleridge the next morning, the wagon rattling over frozen ruts, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Cora's house was small but warm, and when Adelaide's aunt opened the door and pulled her into an embrace, Adelaide felt something inside her chest crack open. She had not realized how much she had missed being hugged by someone who loved her unconditionally. Someone who did not want anything from her except her happiness. Cora had tears running down her face when she finally let go. You look good, child. Healthy. Happy even. I am happy, Adelaide said, and realized as she said it that it was true. For the first time in 5 years, she was happy. During the week in Coleridge, Adelaide met the neighbors. The Hendersons, a Scottish couple with 6 children. The Pattersons, who ran the general store. Sheriff Miller, a gruff man with kind eyes who asked pointed questions about whether Adelaide was at the Revere Ranch of her own free will. She assured him she was and saw the relief in his expression. But it was the women who surprised her. They did not gossip about her living situation. They did not whisper behind their hands or treat her like a scandal. They welcomed her, invited her to a quilting circle, asked her advice on teaching children to read, treated her like she was already part of the community, not an outsider trying to earn her way in. Adelaide realized, sitting in Cora's warm kitchen with 3 neighbor women and a quilt stretched between them, that she had found something in Idaho that she had never had in Boston. Acceptance, not because of who her family had been or what she could offer socially, but simply because she was a person who was trying her best. That was enough here. It had never been enough in Boston. On the ride back to the ranch, the wagon rolling through mountain country painted gold by the setting sun, Adelaide broke the comfortable silence. Sully told me about the night you fired your gun at the sky and prayed. Dalton's hands tightened on the reins. His jaw went tight. The boy talks too much. Are you ashamed of it? Yes. Don't be. I prayed too. When I was walking through that desert when I thought I was going to die, I asked God to let someone find me, to give me one more chance. She paused, looking out at the mountains, and then Henry came along. And then you were there. Dalton was quiet for a long time. The wagon wheels creaked. The horses snorted and shook their heads, making the harness jingle. Finally, he said, I've been thinking about that, about how many things had to go exactly right for you to end up here. The stagecoach axle breaking, you deciding to walk, Henry taking that particular road, the ranch being the closest place. He turned and looked at her. It doesn't feel like coincidence. No, Adelaide agreed. It does. It doesn't. Something passed between them in that moment. an acknowledgement that their connection ran deeper than a letter written by a well-meaning brother, deeper than circumstance or convenience, something that felt almost like destiny. Dalton wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to tell her that he had been thinking about her every moment of the week she had been gone, that the cabin had felt empty without her in it, that he had finally admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny for weeks. He was in love with her, but he held back, afraid of moving too fast, afraid of frightening away the best thing that had ever happened to him with the intensity of what he felt. Winter always ends, he said instead. The same thing his father used to say during the hardest months when the cold seemed like it would never break. Adelaide looked at him and smiled, understanding what he was really saying, that this fragile thing between them would have its season, that patience was required, that good things were worth waiting for. That night, for the first time since she had arrived at the Revere Ranch, Adelaide did not bolt her bedroom door. She was not entirely sure what it meant, but she thought perhaps Dalton would understand. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by Henry Walsh, who looked grim as he handed it to Adelaide. It had been sent to Cora's address and forwarded to the ranch. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant, educated, expensive. The kind of penmanship that came from the finest schools and private tutors. Adelaide knew who it was from before she opened it. Her hand shook as she broke the seal. The letter was brief, the language was precise, and the threat was unmistakable. Adelaide, did you think distance could hide you from me? I've sent men to find you. They've succeeded. I'm giving you 1 week to return to Boston voluntarily. If you refuse, I will come personally. And believe me when I tell you that the ranchers you are living with will not enjoy the consequences. You belong to me. You always have. Harrison Vandermeer. Adelaide read it twice, the words blurring as tears gathered in her eyes. Then she folded it carefully, walked into the main room where Dalton was cleaning his rifle, and handed it to him without saying a word. Dalton read the letter. His face went very still. The kind of still that meant he was fighting to keep control of something violent underneath. When he looked up, his amber eyes were burning with a fury that Adelaide had never seen in them before. You should have told me about him sooner. His voice was quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet. I know. Adelaide's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I was afraid. Afraid of what? That you would send me away, to keep your family safe, that I would become a problem instead of... She stopped. Instead of what? Instead of someone worth keeping. The silence that followed was absolute. Dalton set the letter down on the table very carefully, as if it might explode if handled roughly. Then he stood and crossed the room to where Adelaide was standing, swollen, defiant, and terrified all at once. He took her hands in his. His grip was gentle but firm, and Adelaide could feel the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers, the slight tremor that said he was holding back a rage that could level mountains. Listen to me very carefully, Dalton said, his voice low and intense. You are not a problem. You are not a burden. You are family, and no one takes family from this ranch unless that person wants to go. He paused. Do you want to go back to him? No. The word came out fierce, immediate, absolute. I want to stay with you. Something in Dalton's expression cracked. The careful control he maintained slipped for just a moment, and Adelaide saw underneath it to the fear that had been driving him. The terror that she would leave. That this fragile happiness would be ripped away the same way everything else he had loved had been ripped away. Then you stay, he said, and we deal with whatever comes. Bridger appeared in the doorway, silent as always, but his green eyes were sharp. We're not alone. 3 men in the forest, 2 miles south. Been watching for 2 days. Dalton did not look surprised. He released Adelaide's hands and turned to his brother. You're sure? Bridger nodded once. City boots, expensive rifles, watching the trail. Sully came in from the barn, took one look at everyone's face and said, What happened? Dalton handed him the letter. Sully read it, his expression darkening with every word. When he finished, he looked at Adelaide with something fierce and protective in his eyes. I brought you here. This is my responsibility. No, Dalton said. She's here. She belongs here. This is the responsibility of all of us. It was the first time he had said it out loud, that Adelaide belonged. Not that she could stay, not that she was welcome, that she belonged. And Adelaide, hearing those words, felt something break open in her chest that she had been keeping sealed shut for a very long time. They made a plan. Bridger would track the Watchers, learn their patterns, their numbers, their capabilities. Sully would ride to Coleridge and bring back Sheriff Miller. Dalton would stay with Adelaide, making sure she was never alone, never unprotected. But plans, as Dalton had learned over 5 hard years on this mountain, rarely survive contact with reality. The ambush came at dawn 3 days later, not at the ranch where Dalton and his brothers could control the terrain. On the trail to Coleridge, where Adelaide was supposed to be safe. She had insisted on going to visit Cora, needing to reassure her aunt that everything was all right. Dalton had wanted to go with her, but Adelaide had refused. I can't live my life being afraid, and I won't let him take away my freedom to move. I'll be careful. I'll be back by sunset. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Dalton let her go because keeping her prisoner to keep her safe was exactly what Harrison would do. And Dalton would cut off his own arm before he became anything like that man. Adelaide made it 3 miles before the riders came out of the trees. Two men, both armed, both moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. They blocked the trail, grabbed her horse's reins, and one of them reached up and pulled Adelaide from the saddle before she could react. She fought, drew the knife Bridger had given her, and slashed at the closest man, opening a line across his forearm. But he was bigger, stronger, trained for this kind of work. He disarmed her, twisted her arms behind her back, and lifted her onto his horse like she weighed nothing. Nothing personal, ma'am, he said. His voice was almost apologetic. Just following orders. Mr. Vandermeer pays well, and he wants you back. We're supposed to deliver you to the old prospector's cabin 5 miles east. He'll meet you there. Adelaide stopped struggling, not because she had given up, because she was calculating. These men were hired muscle, not true believers. They were doing a job, which meant they might be reasoned with, or at least they might make mistakes. He's going to kill them, she said quietly. The Revere brothers. That's his plan, isn't it? Use me as bait. Draw them out. The man holding her said nothing, which was answer enough. Back at the ranch, Cora arrived in a panic. Adelaide had never shown up. It was nearly sunset. Something was wrong. Dalton's face went white, then it went hard. He was saddled and riding before Cora finished explaining Bridger and Sully right behind him. Bridger found the tracks within minutes. 3 horses heading northeast. Recent, Adelaide's mare wandering loose a mile down the trail, reins dragging, and in the dirt, a small knife with blood on the blade. The knife Bridger had given Adelaide. She fought, Bridger said, and there was something like pride in his voice. Cut one of them. Dalton picked up the knife, closed his fist around it until his knuckles went white. How far? 5 miles, maybe 6. Old mining country. Dozen places they could hole up. Find them. Bridger was already moving, reading the tracks like a book, following the trail through forests that would have been impenetrable to anyone else. Dalton and Sully followed, rifles, loaded revolvers, checked, moving with the grim purpose of men who had made a decision and would not be turned from it. They found the cabin just as the sun was setting, painting the Idaho sky in shades of blood and fire. Smoke rose from the chimney. 2 horses were tied outside, and through the single window, lamplight flickered. Dalton dismounted, moved to the window, looked inside, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. Adelaide was sitting on a wooden crate, her hands tied in front of her. Not cruelly, but tied nonetheless. And across from her, sitting in a chair like he was taking tea in a Boston parlor instead of a rotting cabin in the wilderness, was Harrison Vandermeer. He was younger than Dalton had expected, 30 at most, handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Dalton made in a year, and holding a china teacup because apparently even in the middle of nowhere, Harrison needed the trappings of civilization to feel in control. Dalton could hear their voices through the thin walls. You cost me a great deal, Adelaide. Harrison's voice was calm, conversational. Humiliation, time, money, I don't appreciate being made to look foolish. Then you shouldn't have hit me. Adelaide's voice was equally calm, defiant. You shouldn't have assumed I was property you could purchase. I made you, educated you, housed you. You owe me. I owe you nothing. I worked for my room and board. I was a governess, not a slave. Semantics. Harrison waved his hand dismissively. The point is, you belong to me, and I always collect what's mine. I belong to myself. Harrison laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. Is that what you think? That running to some mountain in the middle of nowhere makes you free? You'll never be free, Adelaide, because freedom requires money and you have none. Freedom requires options and you have none. You can marry me and have a comfortable life, or you can rot on that ranch until you die of poverty or childbirth or simple boredom. Those are your choices. You forgot a third option. Adelaide's voice was hard as stone. And what's that? I can choose to be happy, even if I'm poor, even if it's hard. I can choose a life with people who actually care about me instead of a life with a man who thinks love is ownership. Harrison's expression darkened. He stood setting down the teacup with exaggerated care. You're trying my patience. Good, because you've been trying mine for years. Harrison moved toward her, and Dalton saw his hand rising, saw the intent written clearly on his face. He was going to hit her, again. Dalton did not think, did not plan, he simply acted. The cabin door exploded inward, torn off its hinges by a kick that had the full weight and fury of a man who had just watched someone threaten to hurt the woman he loved. Dalton filled the doorway, his shotgun raised, his eyes locked on Harrison with an intensity that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Step away from her. Harrison spun his hand, dropping to the pistol at his belt. The two hired men who had been standing guard outside came rushing in, weapons drawn. For a moment, the cabin was a tableau of violence waiting to happen. 5 men, 3 guns already drawn, 2 women, and enough rage in the room to burn down the entire mountain. Then Harrison smiled. It was a terrible smile. The smile of a man who thought he had already won. Mr. Revere, I presume. The mountain man. How predictable. He kept his hand on his pistol but did not draw. Here's how this works. You put down your gun and walk away. Adelaide comes with me, and no one has to get hurt. Not happening. Then people will get hurt, and I promise you my men are very good at what they do. Dalton's gaze flicked to the 2 hired guns. Both were nervous. Both had their weapons pointed in his direction, but there was hesitation in their postures. They were mercenaries, not soldiers. They would fight if they had to, but they did not want to. Your men are standing in a room with me, my brother outside with a rifle pointed at this door, and another brother positioned on the ridge with a long gun. If shooting starts, we all die. Is that really what you want? It was a bluff, partially. Bridger was indeed on the ridge with his rifle, but Sully was not outside the door. He was circling to the back of the cabin looking for a secondary entrance. Harrison's eyes narrowed. He was calculating, trying to determine if Dalton was bluffing. And in that moment of hesitation, Adelaide spoke. Harrison, look at me. He turned and Adelaide stood despite her bound hands. She crossed the small cabin until she was standing between the 2 men, small and fierce and utterly unafraid. You want to know the difference between you and him? Adelaide's voice was steady. Dalton just risked his life to save me. He offered me a choice about staying or leaving. He treats me like a person with thoughts and feelings and worth beyond my appearance. You've never done any of those things. You've never sacrificed anything. You've never given anyone a real choice. And that's why you'll never understand what love actually is. Harrison stared at her, something ugly twisting across his face. Love, you think this mountain peasant loves you? I know he does, and I love him, which is something you'll never have. Money can't buy that, Harrison. Neither can threats. Harrison's hand tightened on his pistol. His face was flushed with rage and humiliation. For a moment, Dalton genuinely thought the man might do something stupid. Might try to shoot Adelaide just to prove he could. Then the barrel of Bridger's rifle appeared through the window pressed against Harrison's temple. Bridger's voice came from outside flat and cold. Pull that trigger and you die before she hits the ground. The cabin was silent. The only sound was breathing, heavy, tense, waiting. Then Harrison very slowly took his hand away from his pistol. This isn't over. Yes, Dalton said quietly, and it is. Sheriff Miller arrived 10 minutes later with 3 deputies summoned by Sully, who had made the ride to Coal Ridge in record time. Harrison and his 2 hired men were arrested, kidnapping, conspiracy, attempted extortion. As Harrison was being led away in chains, he looked back at Adelaide one last time. You'll regret this when you're old and poor on that mountain. I'll be old and happy, Adelaide interrupted. You'll be old and alone. I know which I prefer. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Adelaide sat next to Dalton on the wagon seat, her shoulder pressed against his arm, both of them processing what had just happened. How close it had been. How easily it could have gone wrong. Finally, Dalton spoke. Did you mean it? Mean what? What you said in the cabin about loving me. Adelaide turned and looked at him. At this man who had saved her life twice now, who had given her a home when she had nowhere to go, who had never once tried to change her or control her or make her into something she was not. Yes, I meant it. Dalton pulled the wagon to a stop on a ridge overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the Sawtooth Mountains in gold and amber and deep purple. He turned to face her fully, and Adelaide saw in his eyes everything he had been too afraid to say. I would have given up the ranch for you, he said quietly. Everything I've built, if that was what it took to keep you safe. I know, but you didn't have to, because we're stronger together than apart. Adelaide Fairbanks. Dalton took a breath, steadying himself. I'm not good with words. I don't have fancy speeches or romantic gestures. But I need you to know I love you. I think I've loved you since the moment you woke up in my bed and asked me what my kindness would cost. I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you, if you'll have me. Adelaide smiled, tears streaming down her face. You're terrible at proposals, Dalton Revere. I know. You just told me everything you don't have instead of what you do have. I know. But yes, I'll marry you tomorrow if we can arrange it. Dalton's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, slow and warm and transforming. He leaned down, closing the distance between them, and kissed her for the first time, soft and gentle and tasting of cold mountain air and hope and the promise of every tomorrow they would share. When they finally pulled apart, Adelaide rested her forehead against his. Take me home. You are home, Dalton said. You've been home since the day you arrived. And as the wagon rolled down the mountain toward the cabin, where 2 brothers were waiting, where a fire would be burning and coffee would be brewing, where a life was waiting to be built together, Adelaide knew with absolute certainty that he was right. She was home, finally completely home. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Coal Ridge. It was a simple ceremony attended by neighbors and friends and presided over by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. Sully cried through the entire thing, just as he had at every meaningful moment in his life. Bridger stood beside Dalton, silent and steady, a rare smile on his face. And when Dalton kissed his bride, when he dipped Adelaide in a gesture that was pure romance, despite his protest that he did not have a romantic bone in his body, the small church erupted in applause and laughter and joy. That night, Dalton carried Adelaide over the threshold of the cabin that was now theirs, their home, their life, their answered prayer. Welcome home, he said softly. Adelaide looked around at the cabin she had transformed with curtains and cushions in love, at the photograph of Dalton's parents on the wall, at the wildflower still sitting on the windowsill, at the life she had built from nothing but determination and hope. I am home, she whispered. Finally. And somewhere in the Idaho wilderness, under a sky full of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon, the mountain held its breath and listened to the sound of laughter inside the cabin, to the crackling of the fire, to the beginning of a story that would span generations, a story that had started with a gunshot prayer and a desperate walk through the desert, A story that had been answered in ways neither of them could have imagined. A story of two lonely souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ruins of their past. A story of home,